Last time we covered the developmental history of the Kropatschek rifle. This time, let's check in with the only country to make it their standard service long arm. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is a lot handier than last time. That's because we are now dealing with the Portuguese Carbine de Cazadores. This is an 8mm Kropatschek for, well, the Cazadores. More on those guys in a moment. Let's get it over to the light box. Weighing in at 9.4 pounds and with an overall length of 45.9 inches, this is actually getting to be a little bit handier than our previous long rifle. Now, that length being a tube magazine means only 6 rounds of the 8x56mm rimmed Portuguese cartridge, although the day this came out, it would have been 8x60. Now, last episode was confusing for some because I was talking about a Portuguese weapon and didn't mention Portugal really, other than one brief interaction with the 1881. Well, that's because I wanted to cover the workup in Austria and France, the real workup that decided how this gun would be, because Portugal didn't make a lot of decisions on the orientation or configuration or anything about this gun. They just adopted it as an afterthought in response to an emergency, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The Portuguese side of this story actually begins all the way over in Africa. You see, disagreements between Belgium, France, and Portugal in the Congo threatened to break out into open hostilities, and this was a major contributor to the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. Now, arguably, this was supposed to settle the matter of who got to colonize where, but there was a clause of sorts, the principle of effectivity. This meant a nation could lose its claim if it did not have effective control of the region. Control was secured by treaties with local leaders or by direct administration. Now, these measures were supposed to prevent conflict between the European powers in Africa, and in some regards that did work. There certainly wasn't a war fought in the African continent over these things for quite a while, but it created a sort of acceleration of what was known as the Scramble for Africa. So before European powers wandered into Africa, they found something that they liked, they took it, they're European powers colonizing Africa. As they would just sort of move into regions that had good resources or people, which they then considered resources. Sorry guys. History is pretty dark. Anyway, they would take what they wanted and then they would follow the paths of what was available. Well, this created lots of sort of narrow bands into the interior or lots of coastal settlements and things like that, but it's kind of ad hoc. Well, now it's, you guys need to sort of project where you want to be. Okay, fine. I'll take this and you take that and blah, blah, blah. And then when they say the principle of effectivity, well, this creates two big problems for Africa itself, because now you're in a race to secure that territory. You've got to get in there and be on it, plant your flag. And then on top of that, as you're doing the race and plant, you need more men and more firearms, because it's not always true that you wander into a territory and go, hey, we're from somewhere else and we're in charge of this now. And they just sort of go, okay, sure, that's good. No, you end up having to put some muscle behind it and usually some gunpowder and lead. That's just the unfortunate truth of colonization in that period. Don't get mad at me. So these are the sort of things that are on Portugal's mind when they come up with what's known as the Pink Map. This document sought to link their claims in Angola and Mozambique. Most countries were fine with this, but Britain would stand out as being very opposed. As a matter of fact, Britain had been threatening Portuguese possessions in Africa for almost 20 years. So much so that even before the Berlin Conference, the Portuguese were looking to both upgrade their firearms and break away from the British as being their suppliers of the same. By example, the Portuguese are still carrying around the Snider and the Wesley Richard carbines. So, dialing the dates back a bit, in June of 1878, Fonte Pereira de Melo, who was apparently Minister of War at the time, he was Minister of a lot of things off and on, put together a commission to select the next Portuguese rifle. Now, a single-shot, metallic cartridge, center fire, you know, that's not weird for 1878. I know it seems odd because we've been talking so much in the series about people that are getting ahead of arms technology at that time, but it's not completely behind. And also think about it this way. You're looking for an infantry rifle that's going to be used fired in a line, and it's going to be used mostly in your colonies. You're not looking for a lot of wars with other European powers or anything like that. So you're going up against natives, all right? Well, in that case, you feel pretty confident with firing in a line with a single shot rifle, but also you got to factor in you're packing in all your ammunition, especially in Africa. So you're not going to have an easy way, you're not going to have rail or anything else to sort of resupply. That means everything's carried in, and usually by hand or porters, and if you're lucky, maybe a mule or a horse, but pretty much not even that. So single shot is actually a good way to go in this regard. And so that's what they emphasized, and in a bid to sort of not pay anybody anything else, they actually went with a homegrown design. Luis Fausto de Castro Guedes Diaz was born in Lisbon in 1854. He joined the Navy in October of 1873, serving well as a midshipman. In late 1875, he joined the 5th Battalion Snipers, and would rise to 2nd Lieutenant in 1877. Now, I don't want to go into crazy detail here, so I'll just say that Guedes developed his own vertical locking block single-shot rifle. This was at some unknown point, probably just before its first known demonstration in 1880. Now, I think the Guedes greatly resembles a merging of, say, the Belgian Comblane and the British Martini, but that's only on the outside though. The internals are fairly unique. Guedes seems to be focused almost completely on the action of the gun because barrels and cartridges were ordered from France, both in 11mm Gras. So he was really just working on the block action and pairing it with what was then the best cartridge known, 11mm Gras. And you see this a lot actually in our series. Most countries tend to turn to that cartridge as the basis of what's going to be their next decision before we get into smokeless powder. It's a very good long-range cartridge for its day. All right, so he experiments with it for a while. This builds its way up until 1883 when he requests money from the government in order to file patents. I went nuts looking for these. I cannot find them. It's driving me insane. But he patents the rifle, and it's really starting to get good attention at home. So they order a sample of, I believe, 10 to come from the Lisbon Arms Factory. It turns out they're incapable of producing the gun, though. It's too finely fitted, it's too modern. And so that means that they're going to have to send Guedes over to Austria to visit OEWG. There he would be introduced to the theories of one Eduard Rubin. Recall from earlier episodes that by 1883 the Swiss ballistician's research was well known. Rubin had pointed out that a small diameter cartridge moving at sufficient velocity, along with sweet jacketed technologies, etc., well, it could be pretty dang effective. In his research, a 7 or 8mm cartridge going hell for leather could match a larger 11 or 12mm in terms of power, and more importantly, it shot at a flatter trajectory. This eased long-range shooting adjustments and made it simpler to get a hit. Now, we know in hindsight that Rubin's work would be the future, but at the time, as much as people knew about his successful experiments, no one seemed to want to be the first into the water. Well, having seen results of similar experiments ongoing at OEWG, Guedes was convinced, and so when he returned home with 20 sample rifles in 1884, 19 were in 11mm Gras, and 1 was necked down to 8mm. Ballistically, the performance was excellent, and the new, smaller cartridge meant more could be carried by individual soldiers. It was still, however, using black powder, which could lead to fouling of the rifles, so a paper-patched lead bullet was used. Now, some of you might have a sense of deja vu at this point if you've been with us long enough, because if you're thinking that taking 11mm Gras and necking it down to 8mm seems very familiar, you are correct. That is the birth of the LaBelle cartridge. It's just not using smokeless powder. So reasonably at this point in 1885-ish, we're looking at a very modern gun, except for the fact that it's a single shot fall. Okay, we're looking at a very unusual gun with a modern cartridge. So in terms of ammunition, the Portuguese are ahead of the game. They're actually willing to finally bite the bullet and go do this small bore thing. Beautiful, right? Well, the gun comes back, they try all 20 of them, and the one chambered in 8mm is just so much more useful. It's reaching out further and flatter, it's meaner, like, it's beautiful. They love the design. They're going, okay, you know what? We'll roll with this. This is feeling pretty good. And so that results in the 1885 adoption of the Guedes rifle. Now, the interesting thing about that, if I can just make a little space, is that thank you to our good friend, John. I actually have one of those here today. So we can actually take a closer look at this gun and just quickly get an idea of what the Portuguese were going for before they ended up with what they got. So let's get a closer look. Ooh, that is attractive. Now let's just get down the line here. Long, thin barrel, side mounted bayonet lug, slanting, swivel. Walker down, midpoint barrel band, rear sight, which should look very familiar from last episode. I don't think I need to go into details here, right? Now remember, we're back in time. This is not 1886, this is 1885. So this sight was designed for the Guedes and then put on the Kropatschek, which is getting ahead, but you guys already know that. So I'm gonna come back here. We've got, standard rifle at the rear, and then we've got our sort of vertical locking block. So I would yank on this lever here. So I'll pop that guy, which is actually quite surprisingly tight. This might have been done that way to fix a problem that we'll talk about in a moment. And then I'm going to pop her down. That leaves her open for me to be able to load a single cartridge. Has an extractor point here that rotates. So if you watch carefully, there's the extraction. Single load another one, close her back up, and she's in lock, ready to go. There's a safety here behind the trigger. It's just a button that you press over, and it ties that so that it can't be pulled. Just a trigger lock, very simple. Overall, an interesting rifle. I will say, look at the back here. This is the most bizarre feature. I'd really like to cover this gun someday. It's just not in the cards for right now. Very square. Probably very uncomfortable to shoot, actually, because the minute you grab this, I mean, people laugh about the sort of rectangular Glock, but that thing's ergonomically designed for your hand. It's just the slide that's square. This is where my hand is going. I've got a very sharp edge, very flat. I mean, this is uncomfortable, and I can get here, and I still have a very sharp edge digging in my hand. I'm not sure what was going on with this design back in here. I don't know if it was just sort of drawn that way and they just kept with it, but this is extremely uncomfortable to me. Ugh. All right, so I'm very sorry. I know a lot of you want me to immediately start shooting this thing, but that would require some very careful checks, some very careful loading, and it's not a World War I rifle, as we'll see in a moment. But getting back to 1885, well, earlier I said it wasn't crazy to have a single-shot rifle in 1878, but 1885, a lot of things are happening. Maybe Portugal should be thinking about not adopting a single shot, but let's look around. Let's see what everybody else is doing. Okay, the French and Germans, they have repeaters, sure. And the Swiss have for quite a while. But Britain? Russia? The US? Yeah, it's still a mixed bag at this point, and Portugal is really only worried about Africa. Again, they're not looking to have a war with other Europeans. And by the way, they're not just adopting this one single-shot rifle. No, because they're about to talk to OWG, and they're going to put in an order, albeit not that big, for a number of carbines, a number of shortened rifles, and they're going to be repeaters built on, well, the Kropatschek system, because they've got troops that are more shoot and move, that are more trained, that need to have something a little bit better than the single-shot line infantry. These are people who are not expected to just fire under command, and therefore don't automatically benefit from having the single shot. So, okay, that's pretty fair. So when the contract was made with OWG in 1885, they requested 40,000 Guedes model 1885 single-shot infantry rifles, and 9,000 Kropatschek short rifles, which they also called carbines, carabinas, and 3,000 Kropatschek carbines, what we think of as a carbine. And all these guns were in that 8x60mm small bore cartridge. Alright, so why the Kropatschek? Well, at that time from last episode, this is when that pays off. Because we know that in 1885, the Mannlicher clip is just being brought to trials, and maybe not even that early in the year. Alright, so this is the best repeating rifle available. And if you stop and think about Portuguese perspective on this, the Germans have just adopted the Kropatschek magazine system. The French had adopted the magazine system. They're adopting the magazine system along with the bolt system, which is very closely cloned from the Germans. So they are very, very up to date. And they're going one step further because ahead of everybody else, they're adopting a small bore 8mm cartridge. So actually, Portugal's about to have the most advanced repeating rifle in the world in 1885. That's actually kind of interesting to think about because when we look at this gun in hindsight, we think of it as being immediately obsolete. And that tells you how fast things changed in that period. 1886, we see the Mannlicher loading system. 1887, we see the realization of smokeless powder to the rest of the world. The French had already known about it for a year. Well, yeah, okay, you had two big hits come right after the adoption of this gun. It was just poorly timed. Still the most advanced thing they could have possibly gotten. Now, why are they doing it just in carbines? Well, technically, by the way, I want to clarify this. They call this a carabina. I consider it to be a short rifle length, and I think a lot of people at home would consider this a short rifle length in sort of the American vernacular, so that's what we're going to go with, but it's considered them carbines. Well, they went with 2 carbines because they had 2 types of specialty troop that they wanted to arm with repeating fire, and the first of those would be, well, essentially, they're going to be light infantry, they're light infantry. They hit hard and fast, they cover terrain really quickly with lighter equipment, and they are called hunters, Cazadores. Boy, what does that remind you of? Yeah, these guys are totally Portuguese Jaegers, but they don't speak German, so they went with Cazadores. So, like our German Mauser 71 Jaeger Buchse episode, these guys were light and mobile, just like I said. They could use a light, fast-firing, shortened rifle. Alright, so this guy's not out of the picture yet. I'm just putting him aside, because we're going to talk about this gun, because even though this would eventually become the model 1886, we'll tell you why in just a moment, the Cazadores Carabina was already going to be ordered in 1885, so they must have already had a pattern that, if not exactly this, was dang close. I haven't been able to find any notes on any changes between the 1885 and 1886 orders, so let's go ahead and take a look at what they're ordering up. Hey, well, overall, it's the same action we saw last time. Same spur, same magazine cutoff, same safety, all the Mauser 71 style. We have the exact same loading system now with only 6 cartridges. Really, the differences come in at the length. Much handier. By the way, all the fittings up here are the same, it's just shorter. And if we look right here at the rear sight, we got a new rear sight. And it's a pretty big departure, actually, because this rear sight is not based on the Guedes. So before, with the... Here, let me get it back out. Oh. Before, with this particular gun, we had what is very clearly the Guedes rear sight, right? So flip forward for battle sight, flip back. We talked about all this, and we talked about some of my pains with it. Let me get this out of the way. Ha! If we look again, now we have a much more traditional ladder rear sight, which actually has nice protector wings that keeps it from being damaged. We're only really hanging this much out in the wind. You can tell this gun really hasn't seen a lot of damage to its rear sight over years of use, so good job. Now I'm gonna flip this guy up. And that's it, really. We have a long-range adapter, we have, long-range elevator here, and this little crossbar is just sort of pinch held in. There's no special mechanism, and I expect after years of service, it's going to be fairly easy to knock loose. Unfortunately, a couple shots and it might shift down on you. So probably not the strongest rear sight I've ever seen, but certainly a big improvement over the previous. The big message here is it's shorter and it's lighter than our rifle from last time. But this will blow your mind. This came first. So our rifle is actually a lengthened version of this because the Portuguese adopted this pattern or something very close to it in 1885. So they'd already seen it. And then, as we're going to see, they later go, oh, I guess we need an infantry rifle. And so this is going to get bumped out. So wrap your head around that one, guys. This is the first Portuguese Kropatschek pattern. All right, so let's get this over to Mae and let her get some trigger time with it.
Certa manhã, sabendo ela que bom pintor passava ali, mandou pintar na sua cela Santo António só para si. Cheias de inveja, as outras freiras, num preço ao ver que o Natal, ao pintor pedem muito lampeiras, é um tanto igual, clink, clink, clink. vão, quando toca a oração, para rezar a Santo António, logo as freiras todas vão. Vão, quando toca a oração, para rezar a Santo António, logo as freiras todas vão. Um desgosto dos demónios. Com muita fé, rezem ao santo, mas o pintor que maga não. Promete às freiras, no entanto, que os meninos
Overall, it looked like it handled better, but to me that action seemed a little bit stiffer. Although at 140 years old, I'd probably feel pretty stiff too. We are not done yet, however, because don't forget I said that there were another 3,000 carbines also ordered in the original contract. Predictably, these were for the cavalry, who like to stay highly mobile on their horses. They wanted a light, short, and handy repeating fire carbine, and they got one. By the way, this is a photo manipulation. I had to make it because I'm unsure if any of these still exist out in the collector's market, for reasons I'll cover in just a moment. Alright, so that takes care of the carbines, the initial two from 1885. If you think you know of another one, wait. And then, we still have this in play. So the Guedes is going to be produced. So they start cranking through the Guedes, and there's a problem. The first problem, actually kind of minor. Let's take a look real quick. So here's our gun. Open the breech, turn her around. There we go. And you can see down in here, right? Patented and plastic. We're looking for, oh my God, I'm doing this off the monitor. This little piece of metal down in here that's gonna go back and forth. That's our extractor. So, see? You know what would be really helpful is if we had 8x60 Guedes. 3D Arsenal is the best. They can make anything. So, let's pop this guy back open. Sorry, she's a little stiff. And I'll put this guy in there. And I want you to pay attention to the extraction. So I shove her all the way forward, I close her up, and then as I pull her out, once I give her a little swift tug at the end here, she pops out. Now if I do that at full speed, like I'm actually shooting the dang gun, pops her out real good, right? And this is a fairly light cartridge, so it's not gonna extract as well as one that's got some mass behind the case. So this guy pivoting in here, I'm gonna wiggle it and then let go. That guy, well, he used to be more linear, and that was causing problems, and it was binding. So they went in there and modified them. They made them more rotational. They strengthened them up, and boom, you start extracting again. So with that resolved, it's back to full production over OEWG. The gun is safe. But by March of 1886, another issue came up, which is that one that I can't seem to replicate, but I've only handled a couple of these guns. Apparently a good swift smack to the buttstock. No, I'm unable to duplicate. But apparently what it was doing is that it was knocking the action open. So it would just fall open. So maybe cartridge falls out, maybe not. You know, you do your drill and you slap the butt down and this flops and your cartridge spills. That's weird. Although I don't know why you'd be drilling with a live cartridge. Anyway, the Portuguese did not like this. They wanted the guns to stay shut. So they go to OEWG and say, hey, we need these tightened up. We don't want them falling open. OEWG says, oh, that's an inherent flaw to the design. There's no way to prevent that. I have my doubts because this just clicked into place really tightly. Somebody needs to get in to do some like heavy research on this period, but something's going on. OEWG doesn't seem to want to make these all that desperately, and I don't blame them. It's not their design. They don't make any real, I mean, they make money producing the gun, but they're not making any of that good royalty money. So anyway, this goes back and forth for a while, and OEWG essentially says, we can't guarantee it. It's going to do that when you slap the butt. And so the Portuguese are kind of over the barrel, and they're going, all right, fine, sell us something else. So they declare this rifle as unserviceable, and they surrender the entire contract for it, and they turn back over to OEWG and say, what can you give us instead? And the OEWG, of course, happily says, we got the Kropatscheks. We'll just give you this length in a Kropatschek with these sights, and you'll have an infantry repeater, and you'll be very up to date, and it's better for you anyway. And they go, all right, how much? Well, the Guedes was 68 francs a pop, whereas the Kropatschek cost 85.5. Oof. The rifle was declared unfit in April of 1886. At that time, it's said that OEWG had completed 18,000 rifles. Portugal requested a reduction on the contract, but they said nope, best they could do was replace the remaining 22,000 with a Kropatschek infantry rifle at that increased price. Now, to be fair, these are way better than the Guedes, and as we'll see, they will not age as poorly. OEWG wasn't completely heartless. They kindly negotiated the sale of some 8,000 or so Guedes rifles to the Transvaal and Orange Free State, who would use them in the Boer War. Well, she saw one conflict. That's interesting, and a totally different story. Again, I'd like to talk about this rifle in its own sake someday. But for now, that 10,000 unit discrepancy, where did they go? Well, they probably never existed. As a matter of fact, OEWG's own documents show roughly 8,000 units produced to these guys, not 18,000. I'm not sure where the number comes from, and I have two suspicions. They kind of depend on how much Portugal actually signed over for a check. Because if Portugal signed over more money than the total original contract, well, then that means that that 10,000 produced were probably some sort of billing for changing, like the cost of 10,000 rifles was equivalent to the changeover for tooling or something else, because I know everyone wants to say OEWG probably lied to them and didn't actually produce 10,000 rifles, but that's a big number to lie about, and it's OEWG. They have very good standing with lots of nations. It feels like a risk on their part. So I suspect that that number, 10,000 rifles, represents a cost of 10,000 times either Kropatschek number or Guedes number in difference of price for the changeover. So that could be billed out as the changeover for tooling if the total costs went up, or if the total cost of the contract stayed the same, that would mean that that 10,000 is the number that disappeared in order to make the whole number come out the same for switching from Guedes to Kropatscheks that cost more. Am I making sense? So it's an adjustment number. I highly suspect it's an adjustment number. I just can't figure out where it came from in the research and where it would be applied to the billing, because I haven't seen the actual check that anybody paid or any records thereof. This is a period in history and a selection of arms from a country that could really use a dedicated researcher. I sadly do not have that time or that access. All right, so don't get mad at OWG yet for ripping them off. We don't know. That's the short answer. Anyway, the Guedes rifle is done for. So I'm going to put that aside, and let's revisit Luis Guedes himself. Well, he requested leave to investigate a fix for his rifle and add a magazine. This was granted, but obviously it went nowhere. He would rise in rank over the years, serving on various small arms committees and even being governor of Kasongo. In 1902, he would become a colonel and was wounded by an explosion that damaged his sight. Still, he mostly recovered and was part of the committee that selected the Mauser Vaguero. We've covered this one. In 1907, he made general, and in 1913 he was arrested for aiding and plotting a coup against Afonso Costa's government, and he was exiled to the Azores for a time. Returning home to Lisbon, he would explore chemistry and medicine until his death in 1926. Interesting times breed interesting lives. So, we now have the Kropatschek 1886 long rifle. Excellent. And along with that, we're going to get a slight change in the ammunition. It's now a steel-jacketed bullet, the model 1886. Throughout the production life, we'll see both steel and cupra nickel-jacketed bullets, something which was actually quite common for anything coming out of Steyr in that period. Alright, so let's review. Portugal wanted the Guedes rifle, and the Kropatschek carbines, but that was changed to a Kropatschek rifle and carbines. So, infantry, cavalry, and Cazadores were covered. These guns are all ordered and delivered fairly quickly, and in fact they were likely all completed by the time France ruins everything. Yeah, they adopted the Lebel, one of the most revolutionary rifles ever. You see, it was a tube-fed bolt-action repeating rifle. Actually, it was a Kropatschek magazine, but the gun used a small-bore 8mm bullet in a neck-down 11mm Gauss case. Oh. Okay, so yeah, the Lebel was not revolutionary, nor was its cartridge. It was the powder. The smokeless powder was revolutionary. And to be fair, that powder changed everything. It immediately made this gun and many others obsolete. But that doesn't mean that this was obsolete the day it was adopted. I think because this gun says 1886 on it, and the Lebel is called the model 1886, people think that this was adopted, at the same time, or after. But no, this gun is started in 1885, and then was a modified contract in 1886. So yes, this shows up in 86. The Lebel is the model 86, but really doesn't show itself to the world the next year in 87. So this is just a case of bad timing. And I know I'm really hammering that point, and I'm sorry. If that man hadn't discovered that powder for like 5 more years, we would be singing an entirely different tune about this gun, and you might have seen it adopted by many more powers. Or it still would have been beaten out by the Mannlicher, just like we saw in Austria-Hungary. It's so hard to tell, and that's what makes history interesting. You can have one of the best ideas in your field and be beaten out by a slightly better idea, or there could be a better idea out there, but it gets adopted more widely, and then you end up with things like the Mosin Nagant, a terrible rifle that was fielded in the millions because we're already used to making one. Momentum is its own thing in a lot of cases. And so the momentum of those contracts with Portugal for the Guedes carried on into this gun, which was still better than the Guedes. Feeling pretty good at this point. So that momentum will carry us into 1887 when the Navy took in 3,000 more of these rifles, likely direct clones of the infantry model. I was unable to find any difference in the notes. In 1889, 4,800 new carbines were ordered for sappers, engineers, and treasury guards. Now, I'm pretty sure I found evidence of what this model would look like, but take this with a big grain of salt as I'm not 100% sure. Basically, it's the cavalry carbine, but with an integral bayonet lug on the front band. And I say integral because, well, we'll see something in a moment. This pattern may also have been used for 1,000 naval carbines ordered in 1894. I am not 100% sure. This is such a small contract that I don't know of a dedicated photo of this particular gun. Now, rewinding just a tad, in 1891, a third carbine pattern would emerge. That makes this the Portuguese Carabina de Artiglieria. I am terrible at Portuguese, I'm so sorry, gentlemen. This is the artillery carbine 1886-91. Let's get this over to the light box. Weighing in at 8.8 pounds with an overall length of 40.4 inches, this thing is decidedly handy and still manages 5 rounds of the 8mm Guedes ammo. Now this gun is the same proportions as a cavalry carbine and probably was one before, so now you can get an idea of how big those would have been. Well, the cavalry liked them just fine, but apparently really wanted to upgrade because they would switch over, as we saw in a previous episode, to that Mannlicher 1896 short rifle. But confusingly, the cavalry carbine modification would be named 1891, 5 years before this gun was ready for service. Why? Well, that's a huge mystery, but for now it seems that the Mannlicher 1896 was the gun that freed up the cavalry carbines for modification. Now, it could be that this pattern was decided on before the 1896 was adopted. They could have experimented and said, hey, if we just do this, we can convert these guns, and then they just locked the model number, went in search of a cavalry carbine, and then came back and did the modification. I don't know. This is, again, where this is a very not developed research topic. Get in there. If you guys really want to be a researcher, this is the topic to choose. The Portuguese Kropatschek has lots of mysteries. But for the moment, let's just take a look at the visual evidence that we have on hand. So let's take a look at this little carbine. All right, right away you're going to see that we have a turned down bolt. That's pretty handy. Same feed system, 5 rounds, same butt, same action, same. Very short though, and we can now see where we have fitted a bayonet lug, and it has been inletted to what was originally a gun that did not have one. So this would have stopped right here and we would have had all wood back here. But instead, they've inserted this piece of metal, screwed it in, and you're done. You have a bayonet lug. That's a pretty handy little way of doing things. So I imagine these sights are probably pretty true to the original cavalry carbine and now true to this particular gun. Noticeable offset there, noticeable offset there. More on that later. Now, overall handier, overall much lighter. Let's see how Mae does with this particular little carbine.
As freiras todas à porfia, assim que tal ouvem dizer, ao santo imploram noite e dia, para o milagre lhes fazer, sendo o pintor tanta canção, diz logo santo ao fechar, e o menino a cada freira, dar, clink, clink, clink. tlão, quando toca a oração para rezar a Santo Antônio. Tlim, tlão, quando toca a oração para rezar a Santo Antônio, logo as freiras todas. Dalfino e às freiras no pedido seu, que em Pompino em cada cela apareceu, tinha que ver em certo dia. Quando toca a oração para rezar a Santo Antônio, logo as freiras todas vão. Tlim, tlão, quando toca a oração para rezar a Santo Antônio, logo as freiras todas vão.
You know, I am not gonna lie, this has been one of my favorite little guys to play with. I don't know that I'd fight with it, but it is so dang cool looking, right? Alright, let's get back into the recap of models because there's so many I'm starting to get dizzy. Alright, we've got the infantry and probably the navy. We've got the Cazadores. We've got the cavalry. That was then converted to the artillery. And we have those engineer/treasury guard models, and they were probably cloned over to the navy as well. Alright, everybody following this stack so far. Now again, before you base all your hopes and dreams, that list is subject to change as people understand these guns better. Alright, so that's where we are. In 1896, we see the first taste of smokeless powder in that cavalry short rifle. We covered that in our Mannlicher episode. Well, that means that Portugal is now set to adopt smokeless powder production at home. And in doing so, they go ahead and modify their existing Guedes ammunition. This resulted in the 8x56mm cartridge, which has caused a lot of confusion over the years. Overall performance was roughly the same, although I'm sure the pressure curve was different. Anyway, this would become the model 1899 cartridge. Now, I constantly see forum posts and questions about whether or not you can use 8x56 or 8x60. I have both. Thank you, C&Rsenal. This is great for demonstration, so I can show you guys what's going on here, because everybody wants to know, did the rifles get converted in some way for the change in cartridge? And the answer is no. So let's zoom in. All right, there's our gun. Gonna open her up, right? I'm gonna set that down where you can see, and then I got these guys. They're probably a little bright. The guns are usually much darker. This is 8x56. So I'm just gonna pull two out. And they're a little beat up because I beat them up. C&Rsenal made these for us on request. We gave them dimensions, and then our dimensions were not quite accurate enough, so we had to buff them down. So if you see any scratching or sort of chipping, that's us making last-minute modifications to the bevel and other things so that we could get it in line. That was... By the way, they would have taken care of, they would have reprinted the whole thing for us. We just said, no, we're fine. We can just make the quick mods. We sent you the wrong data. So anything you want made, talk to these guys. They are really good about this sort of stuff. So these are, let me see if I can get you where you can see these. These are the Guedes with their long cases. And then these with the short cases. And I know there's not a lot there. So if this is a little over bright, the case ends here. And on these guys, the case ends there, much shorter case length. You would think it would be a problem, but take note, the overall length is the same across everything. That's so that the Kropatschek magazine will load the same number of cartridges and the spoon will feed correctly. It has a cartridge stop, but that spoon still relies on having just about the right length for it to pop into and then be lifted up. So OAL stayed the same. The other thing that's very important is the rim stayed the same because this gun head space is on the rim. So I can put in any combination of these cartridges and it's going to feed. So you do not need to worry about when you're hand loading something like this, although I'm not sure why I went that far. There we go. When you're hand loading something like this, you don't need to worry about which case length / bullet length. So if you've got a shorter bullet length available for you as a hand loader, make a longer case if your die will accommodate it. So, you know, other way around's fine too. And the Portuguese, it didn't matter. So hopefully that helps sort of solidify that it doesn't, you know, I'm holding two of the same. Hopefully that solidify, how did I do that? Anyway, they're interchangeable. They're perfectly fine. It's the rim and the overall length that matters, not the case length. All right, the bullet's still making it to the throat. Everything's lining up the way it should be. You're not getting blowback, or you didn't see these guns trying to gas Mae during the shooting segments. It's fine. We used the shorter case length when we developed ours. All right, so with that covered, I want to talk about one last little thing when we're speaking about ammo, which is that just like in our Mauser 7184 episode, these guns lock on only one side, and therefore they're going to have some walk. The sights will have to be adjusted accordingly, and over time, the more they're used, the more they're going to stretch and bend. These guns are going to naturally fall out of precision much faster than a symmetrically locking lug gun. Now you can see more about that in our Mauser 71 and 7184 episodes. So, my mess aside, let me just, you should put things where they belong, and gently. Those are very tough 3D printed cases. Okay, anyway, I've said enough about them. I love it when people work with me. If you guys have something that you're good at, always let us know. We love having that kind of help with the show. It's fantastic. All right, so along with the new cartridge in 1899, they also had some complaints coming out of the colonies. The guns didn't have handguards, and so were hard to handle once heated up, especially for bayonet fighting, which is a thing that could happen. And then, two, in that same vein, especially with the new ammo coming, it was probably going to make things worse because, you know, heat. Well, they were having some problems with heat mirage. It's a very long barrel, and it starts to cook up, and you're looking down the sights, and there's heat coming off of it in little ribbons, and so that can mess with what you see. And so they would release a new modification of the original infantry rifle, and that would be this. Ooh. Still the Portuguese Espingarda, still the 1886, but now /99. This is the quote-unquote colonial version of the gun. Let's take a look at the light box. Still 52 inches in length and now a little over 10 pounds, this is a heavy, awkward gun. It still has a magazine capacity of 8 cartridges, now very distinctly an 8x56mm rimmed, although as you know, anything will work. Now we are all the way in 1899, so you guys can think of some fairly impressive guns that have come out in that period. What is Portugal doing in order to keep up with that? Let's take a quick look. So just zoom on in. Now, if we look, whoop, don't drop it now. There's a handguard. That's it, that's all the changes. They added a handguard. It's been relieved so that the sight fits down in there, but yeah, I don't know why this wasn't on the gun to begin with, guys. Handguards are pretty cool. It's a half handguard too. It doesn't even go. There's a handguard. All right, so obviously this gun doesn't merit another shooting by Mae. It's the exact same model. They just slapped a handguard on it. We're not going to run this one back out to the range and burn ammo. You guys get the idea. Now, these guns are still pretty cool. And if you look, most 1886 long rifles that you see are actually model 99s. As a matter of fact, I lied to you a little bit. The one I showed you earlier, yesterday or last episode, that gun was a 99. If you were to look very carefully, you would see the inlet in the stock for this to be able to clip in because this just comes off. I mean, it comes off that I don't even understand how these stayed on for 100. Like, how'd you manage to keep them on there that long when it just, that's it. That's all there's no screws. There's no clips. I mean, there's clips, but they were very weak. So I imagine that a lot of these that were imported in the U.S. collectors market, the handguards were lost for obvious reasons. It's hard to know how many of the original 1886s were converted to this pattern because at a glance, they all look like 1886s if they don't have the handguard. And if the handguard's gone, you really have to look carefully, and it's an angle that most people don't photograph at. So if you have one of these at home, take a look. You should see right about where these springs are, a couple little divots in the stock. That'll tell you what you got going on. All right, so we've talked about the gun in pretty good detail in terms of development. Why don't we see how it did in service? Despite being needed in Africa, no one can resist new gear, and so a lot of these were issued at home at first, but almost immediately they saw their way to Guinea, Angola, and Mozambique. Now, while good for policing, they certainly didn't help with the British ultimatum of 1890, which demanded Portugal surrender hope of a unified band of territory like we saw on the pink map earlier. This event is often pointed to as the beginning of the end for the Portuguese monarchy. So, if they weren't being used to sort of ward off other Europeans, what were they being used for? Well, I think it's fairly obvious. They were used to keep control over their colonies and against the native peoples that were there. Oh, man, this is a difficult period in history, but it is one that we must wade through. By example, this is Gungunhana, who inherited the Gaza kingdom. While Portugal had at first sent diplomats to his court, that tricky principle of effectivity meant that they needed to bring him to heel, or risk losing influence over the region. Gungunhana was defeated in the Battle of Culela in 1895 and captured shortly after. Much credit was given to the repeating rifles and a single machine gun. One Portuguese soldier actually wrote home, "The terrible fire of the Kropatschek did the rest, and at 6 o'clock in the morning, the enemy was in flight." Well, you can't say that the Portuguese Kropatschek didn't do the job it was adopted for, that's for sure. Despite this praise, it was outdated though, and like we've seen, it would be replaced twice over. The cavalry took up the Mannlicher 1896, and this apparently became popular with naval forces as well. And the 1904 Mauser Viguero, which we have also already covered. So in a way, we're looking at a pretty sad story so far. You have this gun that was pinnacle at its time, and then right before its peak crumbled, it actually did get adopted by somebody. Thank God that somebody would appreciate this gun. And then immediately obsolete. The next year, and then the year after that, doubly obsolete. Like, it went from a little obsolete to a lot obsolete. Oh boy, thank you France for that one. Now it's out in the colonies, it's being used, for second tier tasks. You don't want to put it up against another European kingdom. You're slowly replacing it with other guns, and it's sort of being pushed out. And so that would be the whole story of the poor Kropatschek if it weren't for the fact that war were declared. Hey, we're back in the fight. Well, actually kind of, because most people know that the Portuguese, generally the bulk of their combat happened along with the British, and they used British equipment. That's their expeditionary force. But they also had to, maintain their own colonies in Africa during this conflict, and that's where they would come up against the Germans. Now, we've talked about this before with the Viguero, and we've gone on to talk about it with the Mauser Jäger book, so go check those episodes out. But the basics, Portugal didn't do so hot against Germany in Africa, and often kinda rearmed them through repeated defeats and retreats. So there's a chance that the Germans got some time with the Kropatschek as well. Really though, at this point the gun was getting down to indigenous troops, Askari. The 16th Mozambique Company was one such unit that, following the Battle of Naulila in December of 1914, noted that their rifles were near useless from years of heavy use and wear, making them inaccurate and unreliable. And that's pretty accurate. I mean, as much as I do care for this rifle in terms of design, by the time of World War I, it was way out of date. So it was used in very limited roles by mostly indigenous peoples in the Africa campaigns where Portugal really didn't do so hot. Not a lot of pride, which may be why we don't hear a lot about these guns anymore. They don't represent a particular period of pride for Portugal, and it's not a particular period that people understand very well anywhere else. And maybe that's just it. We don't know what history to tie to them, and so they become less important in our eyes when they're sitting on the shelf at the shop. But I would still urge people who are curious about this gun, who are curious about arms development, to understand that among a lot of names, this was the king of the early repeaters. It deserves a little bit more respect than we've given it. All right, let's see if Mae feels the same. Let's get these over into her hands and talk to her about her feelings firing the Kropatscheks. All right, once more we've made room for Mae, and this time you're probably a lot more familiar with what I'm holding. I'm really sorry about last time, guys. It was just sort of necessary for the story, but we really are into the Portuguese guns, and it's a lot easier to hand you this one because this is that wonderful little Cazadores. Carbine to them, short rifle to us. I have a hard time calling that a carbine, but I get why they would name it that back then. So, just in your hands, obviously different than the previous one. How does it stand out ergonomically? What are our big changes here?
Big differences, obviously going to start with the weight. It's obviously way lighter, which is nice. Balance point is slightly further back, which is nice. That means that I don't really have to stick my arm too far forward. I enjoy that. The sights on this one, they're slightly skewed to the left and they're taller. Hooray, I can see where I'm aiming. It's a miracle. I appreciate that. Also, I don't feel like I'm going to be able to ding these up even if I try. There's some nice ridges here on the sides, that are encapsulating the sight, which is fantastic. They've Mae-proofed it. Yes. The only other thing that's a real big difference, I'm going to say, is the action on this one was a little bit stickier, But I think that was the gun and not the action itself for this particular type of gun. So I'm going to blame just this example that we have on that stickiness. So you do notice, you will see it in the shooting section if you haven't already watched that, which why wouldn't you watch the shooting section at least before this? But yeah, no, other than that, there really aren't that many differences. I mean, obviously shorter, but yeah, no, it's, and also 6 rounds. I've got 6 rounds instead of the additional few others. So not bad. I think I could stick with 6, and I definitely approve of the shorter version.
Yeah, so just to recap, magazine capacity on the previous long rifle was 8, plus you could probably get one in the carrier and one into the chamber if you really tried. Realistically, it's more like 8 plus 1 is the easy way to load it quickly. There's a lot of fiddling to get that other plus 2. This gun, same issue. It's a 6-round magazine and then up to plus 2 depending on how much you want to wrestle with it. And then I agree with May, shorter, handier. This feels like, to me, probably the best balanced of the Kropatscheks that we've handled. And then the sights, this is something I didn't bring up earlier in the episode, may I? The sights are actually offset to the left on this gun, and the front sight's also offset to the left on this particular gun, but then we saw how this shot. On the carbine, which actually shot dead center, as you saw, the sights were offset to the left at the rear and to the right at the front very sharply. Now, I think a lot of that has to do with later compensation for this single-sided locking lug, because like we saw with the Mauser 7184, they had to drift their sights way over too, and they didn't cut a non-centered notch in their rear sight. This is an off-center notch. Like, I can pop you guys yet another photo so that you can take a look at that. It's an off-center notch, and then the front sight's going to be also drifted over to really eat up for that sort of walk from having a one-side supported breech. It's a real consequence. You really like symmetrically locking lugs are better, period. All right, sorry, let me hand you that back.
Just keeps taking my guns.
I'm sorry. So, where are we at in terms of firing this? Is it doing any better than the previous long rifle?
So obviously with the Cazadores, we talked about the sights. They are better. Great. Kudos. Good job. I was much more centered on my target with this one. Fantastic. Like I said, the action is pretty much the same. The trigger is unfortunately the same. The recoil, I want to say there probably was a difference, but I realistically couldn't perceive it. So I'm going to call it here now. The cartridge best fits the Cazadores because there really wasn't a huge perceivable difference for me as opposed to with the long rifle. Like comparing the two, I just couldn't feel anything different. So nice, good job. Shooting with this one, definitely got a better plus. Unfortunately, still tube loading, so it's going to take me a bit to still fill her up.
I consider that a fair assessment. I found the Cazadores to be the best balanced out of the 3, and I know that's giving away what we're about to talk about next because we do have to talk about this artillery carbine. So before we get into your impressions on the war, let me get that from you. I'll give you this. So this is the one from 91. This was actually cavalry rifle beforehand. It makes a lot of sense as a cavalry carbine. Very short, very light. I mean, still not crazy short. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, it's probably a little bit under a Car 98 AZ.
Maybe it's because it's like all stubby up here. It just feels shorter than what it actually is.
I'm going to argue that this is the most steampunk looking gun straight out of the factory. Like, that thing looks like it comes from an alternative universe. It's super cool. But how are we doing? How are we feeling about the artillery carbine? Or in this case, I mean, you could still speak to it as a cavalry carbine because all it is the bayonet lug. So if you want to think in either term, that's fine. But how's the handling on this? Like, is there any big improvement?
Oh, yeah, I love it. So lighter, handier. Like, so far, she's doing pretty dope. Sights are still good. I've at least got 5 rounds, so that's a plus. I mean, I could do 5 rounds. That still feels like a substantial amount to carry around with me. Unfortunately, turn down bolt, and there's no inlet right here. And, they really couldn't add one there because it would weaken the gun right there too. So it's unfortunate. It's just not my preferred. And also, just clearing jams on that's got to be annoying as heck, And then a point I wanted to mention, these bolt handles don't deposit your hand anywhere near the trigger. They just really don't. And this one just kind of makes it incredibly obvious. Look how far forward I am from the trigger guard even. Like, it's ridiculous where it puts you. It's way up there. Balance is ridiculously nice. Like, this is a handy moving, run with gun kind of thing. Again, unfortunately, tube fed, so not much you can do there. Trigger's pretty much the same. Still hate it. No real difference with the safety. It's just neat that it's like a shorter version of everything. And unfortunately, like the recoil on it though is pretty noticeable in terms of a difference. Like I am going to say the recoil on this one was not my favorite. Still prefer it on the Cazadores overall. If I were to compare all three, I think Cazadores has won my Heartadores.
Okay. We're still filming. All right, so
that's going to be on a Hallmark card someday.
Let's just recap, by the way, because we're in a family of 3. We had the long rifle. Oh, and we did not shoot, again, the 99 mod with the handguard. It's just a handguard. It doesn't change anything. So long, we are in the Goldilocks scenario. We have mama bear, papa bear, and baby bear, right? So that would be baby.
Yeah, I guess so.
This would be mama. And this would be, papa. So
I guess I lied about the sights. This one, it's like, in the rear, it's offset to the left, but then the front sight's offset to the right. So it is slightly different.
That's what I was saying earlier.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's fine. That's just how they were trying to, especially with the short barrel, they were probably having problems with the whole thing veering off because of the single side locking lug.
They're still tall. They're still nice. Like,
oh, no, they read perfectly well. It's
yeah.
kind of weird, but they read well. And you shot, by the way, it's offset that way. That's the gun that shot center. It just shot high.
Yeah,
so
I should
maybe
have taken a 6 o'clock hold and that would have been fine.
Yeah, there may be some banged up, like that sight may be banged up, or they might have been set up a little differently on the carbines because both of these shot pretty much to the same height, but a little bit right. That one shot right down the center, but high. Yeah. Okay, sorry. So anyway, we already had Papa and you already said no. So that one's not going into battle. Now you said this one's your favorite, so I'll go to that one. Is that going with you into battle?
You know, unfortunately, I'm probably going to actually have to say no to all of them because, again, tube loading here, people. Like, the weaker cartridge aside for the smokeless, it's still being tube fed. That slow molasses right there, that's going to be what sinks you.
I'm going to ask a theoretical question. If you had a gun that was highly accurate, a good powerful cartridge, good penetration, but minimal-ish recoil, like controllable recoil. If you had front locking lugs, if the bolt deposited you at the trigger and it had rear aperture sights and a semi-pistol grip stock and it was light and handy, if it was everything you wanted from all of these, but the magazine was a tube-loaded magazine. Is that something that you would give a yes to? And if it was a yes, would it be a confident yes or would it still be sort of like, okay, fine?
Yeah, I feel like I'd be okay, fine, but here's my reasoning behind that because, yeah, those are some solid pluses. One, I'm concerned for the guy who still kept it as tube loading because he just really loved tube loading and that's why he kept it on there even though he's advanced it in all other ways. I'm concerned for him. He needs help. And 2, I'm hoping, I guess I have somewhere where I can like bring the gun down and take some time to load it. I mean, yes, guys, okay, I get it. It's not that slow and you can get fast with it, but this isn't like stacking solo cups kind of thing, you know, the speed competition. No, I'm doing this under fire, expecting to be under duress. I can't see it being the best, so I guess in that theory I would give it just a gentle yes. I'm still worried about the tube loading.
That's fair. I would probably actually agree with that. The tube is a delicate, finicky, although, by the way, this has restored a lot of faith in tube loading for me. This has been the best tube loader we've handled. I've had no feed problems with this gun whatsoever in 3 iterations. One had a sticky bolt, and yet no problems. Like, we just never had a malfunction in this tube loading system that wasn't, well, we did have some ammo that wasn't deeply enough seated that came apart during firing, but that was our fault, not the gun's fault.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I just can't see it. And by the way, you were saying how could you possibly end up with a tube loader but still have all the other features? Realistically, look at this gun. I mean, they already understood semi-pistol grip. Like, they understood that this was good.
They knew my heart.
It's just that to make a semi-pistol grip, the way you consume wood, and Mark's talked about this before in his show, but the way you consume wood and the way the grain has to be aligned, it's very hard to do a semi-pistol grip on a rifle made entirely out of wood. This is a good solution. I don't know why it didn't stick around made out of lighter materials.
Yeah,
so you
don't have to have strong, like the strongest metals for that.
No,
it can't just be a weak metal.
But you could have had a semi-pistol grip, and you could have done a rear aperture sight, and you could have done a locking action that allowed you to have the bolt handle at the rear. Like, all these things could have been done. These are ergonomics issues that took decades to work out as people tried to refine refine the system, because back when this was coming out, you're still just getting through the basics. You're like, I wanted to go bang and not mess up. And then I want to consume as little metal as possible because cost and blah, blah, blah. So, we creep up on these innovations, but realistically, in an alternative, timeline, somebody could have come up with rear aperture sight as standard for some big army, and everybody would have copied them, and that could have happened before repeating rifles. It could have, it didn't, but that could be a thing that happened. So it's just interesting to sort of see the path that it took, because, you change, butterfly farts the wrong way 300 years before that, and who knows? So you laugh, but the guys we talk about and their influence and the decisions that they made, like the names that show up in the show, it's not like they invented it and if it weren't for them, somebody else would have done it. I mean, that's kind of true, but the way it stacks, the order it goes in, and the narrative it tells are deeply affected by who came up with what when, and who adopted it and proliferated the idea, and then what conflict allowed the idea to sort of grow or fall apart. Like, if it weren't for the Boer War, would we have had this long-range obsession right before conflict in which people got on top of each other with machine guns? Who knows? It's weird how there's peaks and valleys. And so that's why I find this history interesting. And that's actually really why I want to talk about the Kropatscheks, because they have long been neglected. I'm very glad to talk about them here today. And then, as much as you guys might be enjoying this, I want to again say at the end of this episode, this is new frontier. The Kropatschek is not a gun that has been well researched by anybody that I know of. Like, I know people who are currently in the process of it, but we're echoing what has not been tested or peer reviewed. So in all actuality, this episode, more than any other, is the most likely 5 years from now to have some inaccuracies in it. And that's okay. Like, when that happens, I'll revisit the Kropatschek if I can.
We'll just redo the episode, like with a label.
I'm happy to do it. I like updating episodes with new knowledge. But this is the knowledge we have now as best we know it. And, there's a lot of guys that wrote beautiful books in the 60s and 70s, and they put all their effort into it. And a lot of what they said are wrong now. And you shouldn't get mad at them, and you shouldn't think that they failed in some way. They did what they had available. Like, they didn't have digitized archives. They didn't have access to other countries, whatever, because those countries were still behind this curtain or doing that. Like, they went with what they knew at that time. And that's what we're doing here. This is what we know. All right, well, with all that covered, we're just going to say goodnight. So have a good one, and check for the announcements after the updates.
Later.
Hey everyone, I am recording this episode 2 weeks in advance, which is pretty normal for filming, but I'm actually compiling everything and won't have any opportunity to add an update. So, this is me from 2 weeks ago by the time you're watching this, if you're watching it new. I don't know the current status of C&Rsenal, so this would be a good time to check in on other forms of social media or see if I've released an independent update video on the YouTube channel. Otherwise, just we enjoy your support on Patreon. If you're watching this very fresh, there's still an Indiegogo t-shirt campaign running. And other than that, I'm going to keep it light and say have a good one.